O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The story of salvation, the story of human thriving in the face of calamitous odds, the story of human family forming in the dissolution of a world that was, the story of life's triumph over death. The story of salvation is the story of a king who was no king. Not as the world would count kings anyway. Jesus of Nazareth, the king of the lowly in a world built for the lofty. The king of the grieving in a world built around denying death's inevitability. The king of peace in a world that trusts in war of all things to bring safety. The king of the dead and the firstborn of all who will be alive again. The story of salvation for all people. It is the story of a king who was no king. To understand salvation, though, you have to go further back in time, before Jesus of Nazareth, to one of Jesus' ancestors, to a king who really was a king in all the ways the world counts a king. David, the king of Israel and a prototypical king. He led armies and was elevated for it. He spilled blood and was cheered for it. He built temple and palace and walls and a nation, a man who took what he wanted without regard to the lives and dignity of other people. He was a king in all the ways the world would expect. This is part of Jesus' story too. Salvation. Understand that God will work her purposes out even with deeply flawed people. God can work their purposes out even within deeply flawed systems. God will be righteous even when I am not. David is part of the story of salvation too. To understand more fully salvation, though, you have to go further back in time still, before David was the king. Because though David was a king, he was not to the manner born, so to speak. He was not anybody who you would expect to be the king. David was a shepherd. He was a glorified guard, a person whose whole value in life was tied up in the fact that sheep cost money. He was the youngest son in a society that counted the oldest son as the best. But being the youngest was not David's biggest problem here. He was not from a family that could hope for any of their sons to be king. His parents were farmers. His grandparents also farmers, barley farmers to be specific. The grandchild of a nobody. This is who God chose to be king. Understand salvation. Understand that God chooses whomever God will. God does not show partiality, favoring the wealthy and the powerful. Such worldly accolades mean nothing to God, who in fact favors the lowly for reasons of God's own. God lifts up the lowly, and this is part of the story of salvation. But to understand salvation more fully, you must go further back in time still, to one of David's ancestors, to his grandmother, Ruth, and to Naomi, who became a foster mother alongside Ruth. Ruth and Naomi, they were family to one another, though there was no blood relation between them. They were family to one another, though there were no legal bonds between them either. In fact, Ruth was not even part of the people of Israel. She was a Moabite, a foreigner. They created family with one another, with the beauty of words. Where you go, I will go. Where you dwell, I will dwell. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Salvation. Understand that in faith, family has never solely been about blood or nation or tribe or law. In faith, family is a covenant, a promise to remain together through all. No one ever need be alone. This is part of the story of salvation. Ruth and Naomi forming family in unexpected ways. To understand salvation more fully, though, you have to go further back in time still to how a Moabite woman and an Israelite woman came to know one another at all, why they needed each other and had no one else. It is because the Israelite Naomi, she had fled her home to seek refuge in another land. She was fleeing famine, but it could just as easily have been war, it could just as easily have been drought, disaster, compounded disaster, and she lost everything. Naomi alone was left alive. Naomi alone was left alive from the family that law and blood had given her. So deep was her loss that she said, I have a new name now. Call me bitter. She lost her homeland. She lost all her worldly possessions. She lost her children. And what was she left with? A foreigner named Ruth. Ruth had nothing either. Destitute, desperate, as low down on the ladder as it is possible to be. Salvation. Understand that this moment of total loss, of grief, of hunger, of death, all of these broken threads, in this moment God was weaving salvation together from those threads. One of their descendants would be king of Israel. One of their descendants would be the King of Kings. This is the story of salvation. It begins from the very bottom, because where else could it begin? Jesus came from a family that had been shaped by famine. What little wonder, then, that he would feed multitudes with a few loaves of bread. He feeds multitudes still with nothing more than bread. He is the king of the hungry, and one who loves a child with a full belly more than praise. Jesus came from a family that knew grief and heartbreak. And so, what wonder that he would weep tears of loss. Even being equal to God, Jesus, the death of his friend, undid him. He is the king of the mourning. And to you who are mourning, God knows full well what grief is. God has drank an ocean of grief dry. What little wonder that the peace of Christ passes all understanding. Because what grief cries out for is not understanding, not for an answer of why, not an explanation of how. Grief calls out for a companion, something past understanding. Jesus came from a family that had to make family up for itself. Blood was too thin and the law was too brittle. His family formed itself of the strongest stuff there is, of love and the promise to be together come what may. What little wonder. What little wonder that you and I, any of us, we lay claim to our place in the family of Jesus this same way. Not by law, not by blood, not by the will of the flesh, not by the will of any man, but by the Spirit of God. Jesus is the King of waters and word and covenant, a family, a people, a tribe that the world cannot take away because the world never gave it to begin with. Understand that God's hand is upon those fleeing for their lives. That God's story is written with the footsteps and the tears and the bitterness of refugees. Though the world should fall apart, God will never abandon those at the bottom of the ladder. The bottom of the barrel, the bottom of the bottle, that is where God looks and finds who God needs for salvation. This is the story of salvation. It begins with two women left utterly destitute, riven by grief that their world has collapsed upon them. This is the story of salvation. The story of human thriving in the face of calamitous odds. The story of human family forming and the dissolution of what had been, the story of life's triumph over death, the story of a king who was no king, not as the world would count kings anyway. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the lowly, the King of the grieving, the King of the hungry, the King of peace, the King of the dead, and the firstborn of all who would be alive again. Understand, you needn't be perfect to be a part of that story. What place would someone who is perfect have in a story like this? You needn't have been born in lofty circles or to have bootstrapped your way into those lofty circles, because God lifts up the lowly for reasons of God's own. You needn't have lived a charmed life of sunshine days, for God hurries to the side of the grieving. And it is God's own hand that will wipe away all tears. The story of salvation, it is one that calls all you need is to come home, to come home, to come home. Thanks be to God.